Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 3 of Global Contenders, the review series for Gran Turismo's selection of touring cars in various subcategories such as ETCC, DTM and even V8 supercars. And in this particular pick we're featuring a vehicle which actually kind of crosses over quite nicely with some of the vehicles featured in the GT Masters series. Because this car is of course a muscle-based racing car. It's not a real race car, it's a PD original vehicle, aka made up for the game, and this vehicle actually makes a pretty good rival, not only for a couple of other muscle-based touring cars such as the Camaro, but also for the Dodge Classic Challenger and the classic Camaro race car, because although those are technically not touring cars, they do rival each other pretty well. They have similar specs, and although this car is newer than them, they still go against each other fairly well. The advantages and disadvantages that they share are very similar. Now, what do you get from this car? Because as a touring car, it does offer a relatively unique package. It's one of the relatively few muscle-based touring cars available. So does that really provide you with an advantage, or is it just an option? Not necessarily a gimmick, but just something that's different but doesn't have much of a bearing. Well, to some degree, the fact that it's a muscle car does change the way the vehicle performs compared to a traditional sedan-based or coupe-based touring car. But in many ways, this is actually very similar, I think, to a NASCAR. The look of the car, the style of the aero, the bodywork in general, the kind of power and performance that it has, and even, to be honest, the handling to some degree is very reminiscent, at least in my opinion, to a NASCAR. In a good way. Because as I've mentioned before on the channel, I believe NASCARs are misunderstood to some degree. They're actually far better track cars than many people give them credit for. Now, this particular vehicle is really well priced. It's one of the most affordable touring cars in the game, especially of the touring cars with really good specs. Now, the price on this vehicle is 220,000 credits, so even if it's not necessarily the strongest of touring cars, there is potential there for it to be possibly competitive or useful beyond just the touring car category. So the question is it? Well, you get a big engine for a start, which isn't too surprising for a muscle car, a 6.1 litre trademark Hemi V8 engine, fully tuned. You're looking at 827 horsepower, as I said, similar to a NASCAR. As far as torque, unsurprisingly, it's very good. In fact, it is one of the torquiest touring cars in the game, at 704 foot-pounds, and despite the fact that the Challenger is a very big car compared to European sedans and coupes, it only weighs 1,285 kilos, and although that is significantly heavier than some of the touring cars in this series, primarily the DTM machines, that's still not bad at all for such a large muscle car. As far as horsepower per tonne, it puts out 644, and the maximum PP is actually a quite reasonable 603, which is pretty low given how much power and torque it has to work with. Now, as far as performance, another way in which this is similar to a NASCAR is that although it has a huge amount of power, the performance isn't necessarily as strong in a straight line as you might hope. Now, to clarify, it's not bad in a straight line. It's certainly not a slow car by any means. The acceleration is good, especially low to mid-range, and the top speed is good enough for most circuits, for sure. But it's nowhere near being the fastest of touring cars in a straight line. As far as handling, it's actually really good in my opinion. Now, the weight is nice and low for such a big car, as we already mentioned, and the power, and the way the car delivers its power, and its torque even more so, is surprisingly restrained. The car isn't rabid, it doesn't shred its tyres anywhere near as much as you'd expect it to, given that there's very little weight to ground those rear wheels. So it actually does a really good job of composing itself and to some degree controlling itself. Obviously you're required as a driver, but it is overall a very forgiving car, I would say, more so than you might expect. Now, around the track, it's nowhere near being the fastest of this series. I don't think anyone would expect it to be, but DTM machines aside, this is a surprisingly competitive car, especially up against the other PD original touring cars, in other words the made up versions. You've got your RX-7 touring car, your Nissan Silvia touring car, multiple Skyline touring cars, the Mitsubishi FTO and various others, and although it can't necessarily beat all of them of course, it is surprisingly competitive even though it does way more than many of them. The power and torque mean that the speed is delivered where it really matters, and that is through corners, because most tracks don't really require top speed, so this car's slight disadvantage in that regard isn't really that noticeable in most circumstances, because the acceleration, especially out of corners with the torque, is effortless and good. Overall, it's a car which I would recommend more to someone who's looking for something different, rather than necessarily the fastest option, because quite simply it's not the fastest option, but it's a different flavour of touring car, which under the right circumstances, against the right opposition, and of course with the right tune and PP level, is potentially a usable and potentially even race-winning touring car, and for a very good price. It's also paintable, which is a nice option to have on the touring cars. So if you're looking for something different, you may want to check out this car. But that's it overall for this particular pick. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.